Lots of times when I hear people talking about efficient markets, I hear things like, oh, prices are really low in this market, so it must be efficient. Or there's a lot of things being transacted in this market, so it must be efficient. This isn't really the way economists think about efficiency. So yeah, low prices and a lot of production or a lot of transactions are signs of an efficient market. But when economists think about efficiency, we think about it in terms of welfare. So if you remember back to week one, we said welfare wasn't really about welfare programs like Social Security. What it was is the amount of benefit someone receives based off of their economic actions and the economic actions of everyone else in the economy. And so when economists think about welfare, we think about it in terms of maximizing, or sorry, when economists think about efficient markets, we think about it in terms of maximizing this welfare, this benefit that everyone's receiving. And so there are cases where, for instance, prices might not be low as a result of an efficient market. It might be that a good is really costly to produce, and as such, it should command a high price. So economists actually spend a lot of time thinking about welfare. Even myself, and I'm an economist who's really focused on technology adoption and sort of automation. And even I spend, I think, a fair amount of time thinking about, well, what's the welfare implications of this? For instance, let's say that we had automation, and as a result, a bunch of jobs are now being done by machine learning tools and robots. Is that good or bad? Well, on one hand, it could be good, right? We could all be doing less work and receiving more benefit, or receiving more, getting more paid and being able to buy more stuff because more stuff's cheap, and we're working less and we're being able to spend time on our hobbies. That'd be pretty good. And I think everyone's welfare would be improved. But there's also the other case. It could be that now everyone doesn't have jobs, poverty becomes even worse than it has been, and because and that just doesn't sound that good. That doesn't sound that good. And so when we think about so whenever we think about really anything in economics, we always have to sort of think about, well, what's the welfare implications? Who is benefiting? Who is sort of getting hurt by a policy? And is sort of the market efficient here? Like, if will the market for sort of AI and robots, will that end up benefiting everyone? Will that improve everyone's welfare, or will it not? I don't have an answer to that question yet, for the record. It's a tough one, and it's one that I am sort of struggling to think about every day. Okay, but we're not going to really talk about AI. What we're going to talk about is we've been talking the last 2 weeks about markets and sort of the buyers and sellers, and we're going to talk about them and their efficiency. So in general, a seller who enters a market has to receive some economic benefit from entering that market, right? If you're going to produce a good, you could choose if you're going to produce a good and transact it in the market, it has to be worth more than the costs, right? Otherwise, you would just choose not to produce the good, or you would choose to produce a different good. It's the same thing for the buyers, right? The buyers can go and buy other stuff and spend their money elsewhere. There has to be some benefit they receive from entering the market, from deciding to buy things. And so when we think about efficient markets, we're saying, hey, I know the buyers benefit, I know the sellers benefit, and the market's efficient when it maximizes that. When there's sort of, if we produce an extra unit of good, there's not going to be, the benefit is going to somehow not be as good as the current benefit. So we'll talk about efficiency more in a second, but what we need to first talk about is, how do we actually think about welfare? How do we actually quantify that as a number? And the way we do that is through surplus. So a surplus is actually a pretty straightforward idea. All it is this. Let's say we're looking at the surplus of a single individual who's buying a good. There we look at them and say, hey, we realize how much benefit they receive from buying that good. And we also look at sort of their costs and how much it costs them to buy that good. And then we say the difference there is the surplus. It's the benefit in excess of their costs from participating in that market. If we were to look at all the consumers in the market, all the buyers, and we looked at all their individual surpluses and then combined them together, that would give us the consumer surplus, or the surplus of the entire demand side of the market. And then we can do the exact same thing for firms and producers and look at their surplus, individual surpluses, combine them, and get the producer surplus. So what we're going to find out in a couple of minutes is once we have the demand curve, computing the consumer surplus is super easy. And once we have a supply curve, computing the producer surplus is super easy also. So we're going to start with consumer surplus. And before we get there, we have to talk about sort of what is the cost to the consumer? Well, what we think about is the cost is what we would call the willingness to pay. This is just the maximum amount of money you will ever spend on a good. So let's do this car example here. Let's say you're in the market to buy a used car and you look at your costs and you look at the benefit you would receive from that used car and you decide, I'm not willing to pay more than $5,000 to buy a car. If that car is $5,000 and a penny, you will not buy it. But at $5,000, sort of the benefit you receive is offset by the costs. Well, $5,000 would be what we consider your willingness to pay. And that just, yeah. And in the surplus equation, that's going to be your cost. So consumer surplus is really the difference between your willingness to pay and the price you actually paid. So for instance, let's keep going with cars for a second. Let's say your willingness to pay for a car was $5,000 and you found a car for $4,000. You were going to buy that car at $5,000, but you were able to buy it at $4,000. What you end up with is an extra $1,000 of benefit, right? You have a surplus of $1,000 beyond the price of you were willing to pay. And so, yeah. And what we're going to see here in just a second is all you have to do is you can use the demand curve to compute the consumer surplus for all the buyers. When we think about consumer surplus, we're not thinking about it in terms of just the individual. We're thinking about it in terms of the entire demand side of the market, every single buyer, and we're looking at sort of their combined surplus. So let's just get right to it and go to the iPad and do an example of how to compute the consumer surplus. Let's say we're given some data. What we have here is some data on areas. What we have here is some data on 4 buyers who are looking to buy a single car each. And so let's just make the assumption that these are the only 4 buyers in this market. Well, what data were we given? All we have is who they are and what their willingness to pay for a car is. So what we want to be able to do is compute consumer surplus for any price. There's 2 primary ways to compute consumer surplus, and we're going to go through both of them. The first one is just to use the definition of consumer surplus as a formula, and the other one is going to be a little bit more of looking at things graphically. So let's just start with the formula approach. So just as a reminder, we have that consumer surplus is equal to the willingness to pay minus the price they actually paid. And so let's just set a price, and let's say that price equals $9,000. So the price equals $9,000, and the first thing we have to do before we compute each person's consumer surplus is we have to figure who actually buys a car, right? We have a bunch of willingness to pay, and we have a price. Well, if we look at sort of the willingness to pay, we see that Ellen has a willingness to pay of $10,000, and so let's make 2 lists. Let's make one that says buys a car, and so Ellen is on there. And then we look at Sarah. Well, her willingness to pay was 8,000. The price is 9,000, so she's not going to buy a car. Winston, 4,000, not going to buy a car. And Sam was 2,000, is also not going to buy a car. And so not buy as a car. What we have, it's going to be Sarah, Winston, and Sam. And so for these three, for Sarah, Winston, and Sam, their consumer surplus is 0. They choose not to enter the market, and so they don't receive any benefit. And as a result, their consumer surplus is 0. So the only person we have to actually compute a consumer surplus for is Ellen. And so let's just call it like this: consumer surplus for Ellen. Well, sort of her willingness to pay here was $10,000. And the price she actually paid was $9,000. And this ends up equaling $1,000. And so here, her consumer surplus is just $1,000. And since she's the only person who, as a buyer, is entering the market, the actual consumer surplus for the market is just equal to $1,000. So like I said, convenience consumer surplus is pretty straightforward. Let's just do another price just as an example. Let's say now that P equals $9,000. Or sorry, not $9,000, I mean $7,000. Well, we have to do this basic same approach. And we have to figure out who buys a car. Well, we go back to our chart of willingness to pay. We say the price is $7,000. And so we look whose willingness to pay was higher than $7,000. Well, we have Ellen here at 10,000 and Sarah here at 8,000. And those are both higher than the $7,000. Winston and Sam are lower, so they won't enter the market or they won't buy a car. And so what we have is that Ellen and Sarah buy a car, and then Winston and Sam don't. They just don't enter the market at all. So before what we did is we just computed out Ellen's consumer surplus, but in this case we have to compute out both consumer surpluses. And so for Ellen and Sarah. So Ellen, her willingness to pay was 10,000, and now the price has changed to 7,000, and so her new consumer surplus is 3,000. And then the consumer surplus of Sarah, well, her willingness to pay was 8,000, and then the price was 7,000. And so her consumer surplus as an individual is 1,000. And all the consumer surplus is it's the consumer surplus of Ellen plus the consumer surplus of Sarah. In other words, it ends up being $4,000. So just an important thing to note here is that as the price decreased, our price decreased from 9,000 to 7,000. When it was 9,000, our consumer surplus was $1,000. And then when it was 7,000, the price was $7,000, our consumer surplus was $4,000. So as the price drops, and this is sort of a general principle, I'll write it down in a second, as the price drops, consumer surplus increases. And we can see where this increase is coming from is that in the previous case at 9,000, Ellen had a consumer surplus of 1,000, and now when the price is 7,000, she has a consumer surplus of 3,000. So her individual consumer surplus increased because of the drop in price. But we also had Sarah enter the market, and Sarah added to the consumer surplus because her individual surplus was $1,000. Before, her consumer surplus was 0, and now because she entered the market and the price was $1,000 lower than her willingness to pay, she got a consumer surplus of $1,000. So in general, I would say this. So note, this is just a thing to definitely remember. As price decreases, consumer surplus increases. Oh my gosh. And the opposite is true too. As price increases, consumer surplus decreases. Okay. And so as the price decreased, where did this increase come from? It was that people already in the market had their consumer surplus increase, and that the people who entered the market as a result of the price drop also had some consumer surplus from entering the market. So this sort of just going for the formula approach is one way to do it. I think that another useful way to think about it is graphically. And so we'll use this as the graph approach. So let's just use the same data, and I'm going to just quickly copy this down. Oh no, let's see. Oh, okay. So